Thanks again, everyone, for being on time. We really appreciate it. And we won't keep you for any longer. So, good evening again, everyone. My name is Mario Wahba, and I'm the Climate Justice Policy Analyst at Citizens for Public Justice, or CPJ. On behalf of Citizens for Public Justice, I cannot thank you enough for being here. Our mission is to mobilize and engage justice-minded individuals like yourselves, and your presence today truly motivates us to continue our work at a time when it's more needed than ever. I'd like to begin in a good way by acknowledging the history and present of the lands from which I'm speaking to you today in hopes of changing the future of ownership rights and autonomy for Indigenous peoples and nations on these lands. I'm joining you today from the lands of what is currently called Denman Island, which lies in the traditional territories of Pentlach, Quamax, and Quelcom nations. Citizens for Public Justice itself is based in what is colonially known as Ottawa, and which sits on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation. I continue to learn and be guided in my work and personal life from Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers, and traditional communities, and hope our shared efforts propel a vision of change that's rooted in meaningful justice and a fruitful journey of reconciliation. A bit of housekeeping before we get started. We have 90 minutes together with each of the four panelists offering a 10-minute presentation. We'll leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions. Please provide your questions in the chat in advance as they come. We'll keep track of them and we'll offer them to the panelists. And if you really want to, you'll have a chance to verbally offer your question, but we would prefer it, since we anticipate a large audience today, if you provide your questions in a written format in the chat. Please feel free to engage with our speakers also, and as well as other attendees in the chat. However, to ensure a smooth listening experience, we kindly ask you to keep your mic muted until we open the floor for questions. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Citizens for Public Justice. Citizens for Public Justice is a national faith-based and faith-inspired charitable organization supported by members from all over Canada who care about equity and justice in Canadian public policy. Our main policy areas are climate justice, which is the focus of tonight's conversation, refugee and migrant rights, and poverty eradication in Canada. One of our overarching missions, of course, across all of these areas is Indigenous reconciliation, and we also engage on electoral and tax reform. We accomplish our work primarily through public education and awareness raising, as well as government relations, something that you will see illustrated by our campaigns later on tonight. One of my colleagues will share the link to our website if you'd like to learn more about Citizens for Public Justice. So the link will be there shortly in the chat. With that, it's my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague Megan from the Canadian Foodgrains Bank, who will introduce herself and share more about the CFGB. Megan, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. Welcome here, everybody. My name is Megan Silencia, and I work in public engagement at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. For those of you who don't know who we are an organization that's made up of 15 member agencies and church-based agencies and member organizations. And these are all organizations that collaborate together to do relief and development work around the world, that is done by relationships with partners at the grassroots level. So essentially, all of our members are working through partners, but coming together to do humanitarian food assistance and agriculture and livelihoods or food security programming around the world together. So everything that we do, while in Canada, we're supporting that with public education and policy work and advocacy work. This is all serving that goal towards ending hunger. So we're joining kind of an intersectional place in the conversation around climate tonight. So just to chat very briefly about the fact that the Foodgrains Bank, along with other organizations and researchers, has advocated for a long time for increases in investments in agriculture, especially for small-scale farmers. And that's been informed directly by the individuals and communities that are served by our local partners around the world. So we're in conversation with them. We hear stories from them, and from those stories and from other places, we know that hunger is increasing significantly around the world, in part due to climate change, and that hunger has a negative impact on the human physical, social, emotional, and cognitive development. And that it's a major social and environmental disruptor that has serious repercussions on peace, on prosperity, on the achievement of other important international goals like the SDGs, as well as the health of our planet, namely the health of not only human civilization, but the state of all the natural systems that we rely on for food, for water, and for life. So I'm pleased to be here representing the Canadian Foodgrains Bank this evening with my colleagues Naomi and Mesfin, and Femi, who you won't see tonight, but who's also here helping in the background. I'll pass it back to Mario just to tell you a little bit more about our speakers for this evening, and we'll dive right in. Thanks, everybody.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Megan. Hello again, everyone. Don't worry, you won't hear too much from me. I'm simply here to introduce our impressive panelists for this evening's webinar. We have 4 outstanding experts with us, each bringing a wealth of knowledge and lived experience to our conversation. Let me briefly introduce each one. Kikishan is an iconic global, Kikishan Basu. Kikishan is an iconic global influencer, educator, environmentalist, and champion of women's and children's rights. She is a TEDx speaker, climate reality mentor, author, musician, and a dedicated peace and sustainability campaigner. She founded Green Hope Foundation, a global social innovation enterprise operating at the grassroots level in 28 countries to empower vulnerable communities in the sustainable development process. Thanks for being here, Kekeshan. And Misfin Matthews. Misfin is a senior program manager at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank based in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. He works with the Nature Positive Food System program, supporting implementing partners and stakeholders in practical and sustainable collaboration, learning, and network building. Thanks again for being here, Misfin. And Naomi Johnson. Naomi is a senior policy advisor on climate change at the Canadian Foodgrains Bank and the co-chair of the Canadian Coalition on Climate Change and Development, or C4D. C4D is a coalition of over 50 Canadian organizations that work and advocate to address the impacts of climate change in developing countries. Naomi specializes in climate finance and food security and has spent over a decade improving policies that affect vulnerable populations. Thanks a lot for your expertise in advance, Naomi. And last but not least, Willard Metzger. Willard is the current Executive Director of Citizens for Public Justice. He's also the former denominational leader of Mennonite Canada and the former head of church relations at World Vision. In 2024, Willard attended COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan, as the only faith-based representative in the official accredited Canadian delegation. So thanks again for being here, Willard. We'll be hearing from each of them, those incredible individuals shortly, and let's dive right in.
Great. So I think I'm starting us off. I'm just going to share my screen, everyone. So this is Naomi here. Just bear with me for one quick moment. Okay, hopefully we can all see that. I have a short presentation for you. So thanks to Megan for kind of outlining a little bit of the connections there with hunger and climate change. So just to emphasize that, we hear over and over from the people we work with around the world that climate change is impacting their food security. It's making it hard to have enough food. It's making it hard to earn a livelihood as a farmer. So this picture actually I took in 2018 in Tanzania when I was there. Meeting this woman who just, remarkably was walking for hours to water her fields. And thankfully, through some conservation agricultural programming, was learning how to increase the productivity. We know that food security will increasingly be impacted by climate change. as many as 783 million people are hungry already, so that number is on the rise, of course. And many of you may know also that last year, 2024, was the warmest year on record. So we continue to see these trends over time. So again, it's not a day-to-day or a month-to-month of weather changes. It's looking at trends over years and years. And so we are now looking at a temperature last year that was 1.28 degrees Celsius above pre-industrialized levels. So just the connections a little more between climate change and food security. You know, some of the main impacts of climate change would be increased temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, frequency and severity of storms. And that's certainly something we hear. I was visiting farmers in the field in November in Uganda and in Ethiopia, and heard more and more about how climate change is just really impacting everything they do, and all of the work that our partners do is so much of it has to do with climate-related impacts now. A big part of that is just erratic precipitation we're hearing, and not knowing when to plant and when to harvest. It's just no longer a given. It's much more challenging to be a farmer these days. We already know that food productivity is down 21% because of global heating. So these impacts are being felt all over. So how do we address these, right? So Megan mentioned we do programming work. We work to provide humanitarian emergency assistance to people who need it, but also to look at the longer term challenges and kind of structural challenges that take place in many of these contexts, and how do we improve food security over the long term, and nutrition as well. So that's a big part of our work, of course, but we've also realized that working on policy and influencing policy is really critical. You can have some amazing programs, but if you have these overarching policies with these really harmful rules, both to the environment or to the communities that are working in the environments, you know, no matter what you do, you're going to be plagued by challenges. And so a big part of what we're doing now is looking at what kind of policies can we influence that will help farmers around the world. And so in being a Canadian, obviously for us, a big thing we can do is impact Canadian policies. And those are important because Canada, along with other countries, gives finance around the world in the form of aid to support communities. And so we can try to influence, what does that look like? Where does it go? How much are we giving? All of those things. Is it really reaching the people who need it most? That's what we're really pushing for. So as voters for the Canadian government, they are very interested in what we have to say, and we know MPs are keen to hear what their constituents have to say. So this has been a really critical part of my work. So I'm looking specifically at Canada's climate finance. And what do I mean by that? Well, Canada, along with other developed countries, gives funding to other countries around the world to help them address the impacts of climate change, right? So some of this goes to mitigation, which is to reduce greenhouse gases. Some of it goes to adaptation, which is dealing with the impacts of climate. And then some of it also goes to loss and damage, which is a bit of a kind of newer or maybe less embraced concept, but that's kind of the idea that no matter how much we adapt and mitigate, there are already major consequences happening in many places around the world. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was created under the UN system to really kind of bring countries together and say, what are we all going to do to address this global issue? When we look at Canada's portion of that, I wanted to raise, first of all, that Canada started really designating money for climate finance in 2010, and that was under a conservative government. So just to say, you know, we have certainly seen conservative governments in the past that are very supportive of environmental regulations and conservation. The 2.65 billion given in 2015 was our first 5-year package. That was, we signed the Paris Agreement, we have a responsibility to play here, and it was 2.65 billion over 5 years that Canada committed. After that, there was a consultation process. Many of us, maybe probably some of you, were part of the advocacy that went into that to really push again for we need to be doing more. We're not giving our fair share of the global commitments. Where is this funding going? And we started to and we ended up getting the 5.3 billion in 2021. So that's where we're at right now. We're in that package, as you would say, a 5-year package commitment. And just this past summer, there were consultations on the next climate finance commitment. So that will be 2026 to 31, likely another 5-year commitment that probably in the next year or so should be announced what that will look like. Just to let you know, in terms of climate finance, what are we looking at specifically? Well, from our point of view, which is to support those who are vulnerable in developing countries, those who are most impacted by climate change, small-scale farmers, some of the key pieces are the quantity, as I said. How much climate finance is Canada giving? So are we giving our fair share of the global goals? So we've committed to these goals with other developed countries. Are we giving our fair share based on the wealth we have as a country? How much are we giving to adaptation versus mitigation is a big one. So it should be a balance, but we know that adaptation is largely underfunded, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But also loss and damage, are we committing to that? So those would be key areas as well, because of course, people in developing countries are specifically vulnerable to many of the impacts of climate change. Is it reaching those who need it most? So LICs being lower income countries or least low income countries, small island developing states. So knowing that the ocean levels are rising, we're seeing huge impacts with already some small islands moving their entire populations or planning to move their entire populations. Women we know are particularly vulnerable and impacted. What about people in these fragile conflict zones? It's hard to imagine how money is getting in there, but certainly they're impacted as well and need support. Also, how are we giving this money? Is it loans or is it grants, right? You may be surprised to know that the majority of Canada's climate finance is given as loans. So we're actually saying, here, we'll help you deal with this problem that you really didn't create, but you have to pay us back with interest, right? So huge challenges there. We're certainly pushing for grant-based funds. And then is it additional to aid? So climate finance is part of what countries would give as aid. And so let's make sure we're not just pulling from other important aid commitments like education or refugees or healthcare or all of these other critical elements that aid goes to, but rather let's grow alongside aid. So just quickly, this past summer, as I mentioned, Canada had its consultations on its next commitment on climate finance. There were about 13 questions posted online that people could participate in, but they also did various engagement and consultation sessions with, as you can see here, a variety of stakeholders. The tricky thing is it is a bit technical, some of the issues around climate finance. And so it's often having to involve a little bit of education to get up to speed to bring the public involved in some of these. But I know some of you worked hard and were engaged in this as well. And Canada also reached out with some of the partners from the Global South. So it's really great that ideally, I mean, hopefully we got a fairly broad input into this consultation process. And this is what they use to help influence the policy that they will put together. More recently in the winter or fall, I guess, we received a What We Heard document is what it's called. So this is what Canada heard in that whole consultation process. And a lot of what we saw, and by the way, this is all online, so we can share that with you. A lot of what we saw, though, was what the sector and what the public has been asking for. So they have mentioned there's been an increase there. The sector is asking for more climate finance. They want us to give our fair share. And right now the sector is asking for a tripling of climate finance, which we know does not even come close to meeting the needs that are out there, but is close to what our fair share would be for now. Hopefully we would scale that up. They know that we need to do more in adaptation, right? They saw that we want to see more in the form of grants and making sure we really are reaching those most vulnerable and most impacted by climate change. So there were a lot of really good things that they heard. We don't know if they'll go in the policy, but we know they heard them and they're written down. The one thing that was a bit of a a loss, I would say, is that the sector has been advocating for a commitment on loss and damage. So again, recognizing that no matter what we do, there's already going to be significant losses and damages for many around the world, and there are, right? Major devastation, storms, floods, fires, everything that's happening. And so to help support countries in recovery of those processes. These can be economic, by the way, losses or non-economic losses, recognizing that cultures, heritage, all of these different important aspects, there's migration that this leads to, all of these would be kind of tucked under loss and damage. So Canada has said loss and damage is important to address, but they haven't recognized that we said they should give a percentage commitment to it. So we're still not seeing any sort of commitment to really taking that seriously. So what we look at outside of Canada's climate finance and to help us influence Canada's climate finance is on the bigger scale, the global policy. And that would be the United Nations climate change conferences that happen annually. So really important, these are huge spaces where governments come together, make decisions around climate change. But this is also where we can work together with various stakeholders around the world and start to think about solutions and work through the problems. This is where we would work through both kind of what we would call the bureaucratic level, so people working in government, but also that political level of ministers and politicians who are making those overarching decisions. And really coming together is key. We have heard from decision makers in the past that where they say, well, every organization wants something different, or who cares if the public doesn't really care? So it's really critical we have learned to work together, to bring our messages together, align our messages, and also to educate and engage the public in these issues. And so CPJ as well, Citizens for Public Justice, as well as Canadian Foodgrains Bank are, for example, part of, I guess it would be a coalition called For the Love of Creation. And it's a faith-based group of organizations and groups around Canada and others contributing to really advocate and engage and work together on these issues. So we continue to do that. Just wanted to let you know that the Climate Change Conference is one of 3 sort of sister conventions. There's also a desertification one and a biodiversity one, recognizing these are all critical issues that impact humans and the environment. Has there been critiques of these? Huge, yes, right? And I'm sure many of you are aware of these. It's been called kind of a circus. There's thousands of people. I think 50,000 people attended the last one. A large percentage of people from the fossil fuel industry attend. And so people sometimes ask, well, why would you go? What could you possibly gain from going? Never mind the fact that we're all flying to these places, right? And adding emissions. But just to say, this is the only global forum where countries and leaders, the key decision makers are coming together and actually talking about these problems. And yes, the progress is slow, but it happens. Over years, we have seen progress. There is so much more happening than there was 5 or 10 years ago. And so we keep working through these issues, and this is a great way for us to make sure we're connecting with decision makers as well, and to make sure they know, for example, that farmers should be included in these decisions. They should be thinking about farmers all around the world, thinking about people who are hungry, thinking about vulnerable populations when we make these decisions. So I'll pass it off right away here, but just to let you know, this last COP was in Baku, Azerbaijan, which is in Eastern Europe, also an oil state. So that's been another challenge with these COPs. But a great opportunity, again, to bring our collective voices together. And we were able this time, the Foodgrains Bank, you can see a picture of me with some colleagues there. We were able to bring a partner and staff member from Kenya as well as Ethiopia. And that's a perfect segue to pass it off to Mesfin, who is here to actually talk to you about his experience and why it was so important for him to be here. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Naomi. Thank you, Megan, for connecting us. Let me share my screen also to ask you to spend some time with me. Okay, can you see me?
Mhm.
Okay, thank you. I was well introduced. I'm Mesfin Matthews. I work for Canadian Foodgrains Bank. I'm based in Addis, Ethiopia, and I work as a country coordinator for, we have a nature positive food system program in the country. So I'm coordinating that program in Ethiopia. We work communities in different parts of the country. Just to mention the current program we implement for different landscapes, and these communities are smallholder farmers, women, girls, boys, marginalized group of people, and the smallholder farmers in our context, the land holding size is on average 0.5 hectares. So on average, 6 family members rely their life on this much of resource. So considering the climate change impact and this resource, you can imagine how the impact is huge for this community. These 4 regions are located in north, as you can see from the map, in northern part of Ethiopia. We have one partner called MSFSO, and in west we have FH Ethiopia, FHE, and in south we have TDA, Therapeutic Development Association, and in southeast again we have Lutheran World Federation. So these 4 partners located in 4 different parts of the country, they work on the respective landscape. So it is landscape-based program. And the climate change impact, I said, it's really, especially in the past 2-3 decades, it is very much serious, and the livelihood of farmers, pastoral communities, and in general, the country's economy is highly affected. And it was mentioned by Naomi also, just to give you how the climate change is impacting, affecting our communities, our people. Drought is recurrently happening in Ethiopia. We are located in East Africa. You know the history of the East Africa, how climate change is really affecting us. As you can see, the landscape, this mountain, people farm this mountain, which is assumed to be protected area, but because of population pressure, farming has been practiced there for hundreds and thousands of years. This is aggravated. Soil erosion, resource depletion. So everybody relies on this kind of landscape, and the impact is huge, and rain pattern is highly changing, the amount, distribution, the onset time. It is unpredictable for farmers, and as the growing season shifts and farmers are forced to adapt to it, but it is beyond their capacity to cope up with that. So that's a big challenge. And floods, landslides. We had a very recent story of landslides in different parts of the country because of too much rain, because of the mountains are plowed, and the resources are susceptible to these kinds of natural hazards. Temperature is rising, and because of this, just to give you one example, in Ethiopia, malaria incidence is very common in lowland areas, but because of this climate change, now malaria is adapting to new environment, highland areas, and farmers' communities are affected by that. Human animal diseases are so common, and we had very recent history in the Afar Borana region bordering to Kenya. We didn't have rain like for 3 to 4 years, and millions of animals died, and the community, the pastoralists were highly affected. So this is the scenario. my experience, my work in mitigating, adapting to this, as I said, my role is just uh, supporting partners to have to engage in learning events, to support each other, to share information, to learn from different contexts, and to work together, sharing best practice and information to partners and members, and working with stakeholders. This is one of the events that we had in December this year. We call it Community of Practice, the four partners with other stakeholders. We came together, learn and share and support each other. So I do that, and networking and connection with government system and other like-minded NGOs, and sometimes also providing technical support whenever possible and needed. It's only not myself, and looking for someone else from government and other stakeholders also to support our partners. That's part of my support in this. Coming to my experience at COP29, that was my first COP, and it was really a big experience and learning opportunity for me. We, in our program, we do have nature-based solution, agroecology, climate smart agriculture, and being in COP29 in Baku, it was really a great opportunity to hear and learn this very important climate action concept from different perspectives from Latin America, Asia, and how people, how governments, how communities practically implement this. So that was a big learning opportunity for me, and connection also. I had good connection, especially with Ethiopian delegates. In this picture, you can see one of our ex-prime minister was there. He's now chairperson for AGRA. So I had a chance to attend that side event, and the lady in the middle, the short one, she's Minister for Plan and Economy. The Minister Plan and Economy Development is now the main government sector for climate action program, the NDDC. So I had that chance, and I had also connection with other people, and that's helping my work. We are now in good follow-up communication and contact to support our partners. It created, being there created that opportunity for me. And I was also one of the panelists in Canadian pavilion, and that was also another experience that I had. So it helped me to understand the global climate action from the global perspectives, and those were my big experiences. What I saw, as Naomi said, and it was really huge, big event, lots of learning, lots of knowledge, experience. I don't know, people were saying more than 50,000 participants. That was so huge. And it's well organized, side events, pavilions, connections, and the volunteers well trained. So it was exciting to learn that kind of big event, well managed, and how people manage to learn and to connect. So it was really a great experience. I was really happy. My feelings, uh, most importantly, two things I mentioned: this nature-based concept. I was amazed how much that topic is loud and big in global south. So I was very much encouraged to hear that. So that was very much impressing. And the campaign, the use, indigenous people, different societies, the strategies they use, that's really, really amazing. I can just yeah. Okay, let me continue. So that was my impression, and I was really touched. And one of my assignment to involve Ethiopian youth, especially with our partners, and I have now a good connection and youth from Ethiopia also represented there. So it's a great lesson how to engage youth in climate action. So this is one of my takeaway. Locally led solutions are very important. Farm-based consultation, cooperation are very important when we are thinking about climate action. And my message, this is my last slide to Canadians and policymakers in Canada. First of all, I would like to thank Canadians and Canada government for supporting us, for results for we are enjoying now the good fruits that we are seeing now on the ground. We are really thankful for that. And climate action is not a one-time effort. It needs viable collaboration and cooperation among all the actors done before. This is the key message I have. And genuine and reliable finance support, especially for climate adaptation efforts, integrating with local capacities. These are very important. Climate mitigation and adaptation, very important, including now loss and damage. But in our context, the smallholder farmers, adaptation can also address mitigation also. It can extend up to that. So millions of farmers are really struggling with climate change impact. So this is my last message. And you can see from here the last message, the picture I got from there. Thank you so much for your attention.
Okay, I think we're jumping to me one more time. I'll be a lot quicker this time. I just wanted to touch on a couple of the issues that occurred at the COP this year, some of the negotiations, and then we'll pass it off to hear from others' experiences as well. So hopefully, okay. Okay, so I think really the big thing that was to happen at this year's COP was a new global goal on climate finance. So in 2009, countries kind of came together and said, well, let's collectively put together 100 billion annually by 2020. So, and this was developed countries, right? So there's a group of developed countries that are going to support other countries around the world to address climate change. That's in the Paris Agreement, that they will do that. They recognize the need for that, but they collectively agreed to give 100 billion annually by 2020. This was kind of an ad hoc number, just sounded nice. It was a goal to work towards. It wasn't achieved in 2020, but most would recognize that it was achieved in 2022. So we saw the achievement of that happen. So this time they extended that goal to kind of 2025 and said, we need to develop a new goal. And this time, let's think about what are the needs. Let's think about what kinds of finance we need, who we need to reach, all of these different aspects, right? Like, let's put a lot more thought into this and really make it something that delivers, something promising, and restore trust. Because I think many developing countries kind of lost trust in this process by not really getting what was committed to them. So it's what's called the New Collective Quantified Goal, or the NCQG for short, is the name of this new global goal that they worked on. Now, when they went into these negotiations, most kind of developing countries, so including the G77, which is a group of 77 countries, we're asking for 1.3 trillion annually in public finance. So only from public sources, that means from governments contributing this amount, they wanted to see 1.3 trillion annually. And interestingly, last year there was a high-level expert study put out to see, okay, well, like, what are actually the needs that people have? It was 1 trillion annually by 2035 that countries needed. So they were right in line with that ask. And this was, again, an expert independent panel that put that together. You can imagine these negotiations are not easily done, right? There's a lot of issues at play, a lot of politics at play, unfortunately. Some of the big questions were, well, how much is this new goal going to be, right? And how much of it is actually going to make governments accountable versus other sources of finance that are out there? Also, who should be contributing? So when the Paris Agreement was made, and particularly when this climate conference came together, and by the way, COP is Conference of the Parties, parties being countries. So that's what it's a little bit of an acronym there. When that all came together, it was decided this is, you're lumped as a developed country or you're lumped as kind of everyone else. Well, now things have changed a little bit, and you have countries like China, like Saudi Arabia, for example, countries that both have depended on fossil fuels, but also have fairly strong economies now that are not part of who should be contributing climate finance. So there was a lot of push about who should be giving the money. In any case, it was very slow to progress. All of the negotiations were kind of waiting on this. So it was a very challenging COP to be at. At one point near the end, finally, some numbers were given, and least developed countries and small island developing states actually walked out of the room because they said, there's no way we can accept this. It's so low and so meaningless. In the end, countries did come together and made a new goal. So the new goal does have the 1.3 trillion in it, but it says basically we should all work together to try to accomplish 1.3 trillion by 2035 from all sources of climate finance. So this could be governments, this could be private sources, this could be taxation policies, there could be multilateral organizations, it could be all sorts, and it doesn't really say who should do what. It then says, okay, we will commit to work on 300 billion annually by 2035 for developing countries. Okay, so we have that specific goal, which is great. Again, it says from a variety of sources. So, and it even says kind of maybe others will volunteer to contribute who haven't been contributing in the past. And so it's really great that, yes, we have this sort of tripling in a way of climate finance, right? The old goal was 100 billion, but it's really unclear where that's going to come from. It's harder to hold governments accountable now. It's hard to say this is Canada's fair share because there's so many different components. So there's a lot of challenges with this. And just to say, I think everyone left this COP feeling really defeated because this is really low compared to, as we said, the $1 trillion needs that are out there to address climate change. Maybe just a couple of silver linings we can say. Some people said, well, it's amazing that we made this agreement, given that Trump was elected just before this COP started. And of course, Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, pulls out of climate policies, does not want to give climate money. So it does impact this global goal, right? There's also a roadmap being worked out, Baku to Belém roadmap it's called, for the next COP, where they're hoping that they'll start to think about what types of finance are in there, how does it look like, who's it going to impact, and there will be a review process in 2030. So the hope is that, again, we can kind of step back and look at this and see what needs to be improved. So that was that piece. I'll just touch on two more pieces quite briefly. Adaptation. Adaptation is always interesting and challenging in these contexts. It is very significantly underfunded. So actually only 5% of global climate finance goes to adaptation. The rest is directed towards mitigation activities largely. So it's supposed to be a balance. That's what it says in the Paris Agreement. But for many reasons, whether it be that It's easier to get funding. It's more bankable, for example, right? There can be profit made on mitigation projects. There can't be really on adaptation very easily. It's less risky when you think about working with maybe people who are in poverty in developing countries. The support providing money can be a little bit risky. Also, mitigation is often seen as kind of a global benefit, whereas adaptation is more context specific. And it's also extremely challenging adaptation because it looks so different everywhere you go, right? What works really well in one context is not going to work well in another. So it's really difficult to measure and to say what's working. Right now, they're working on frameworks and targets called the Global Goal for Adaptation to think about how we improve our commitments and to look at indicators on how we measure that. So I just wanted to mention that's kind of what was talked about at this COP on adaptation, but challenges continue there. And just to quickly touch on loss and damage, so I mentioned what that was already. There's a fund now for responding to loss and damage. Canada's been on the board for that fund, and it's got somewhat operationalized at this COP. So in many ways, it's finally ready to go. And there are commitments to it, but they're very low compared to what's needed. So there's about $750 million committed. We know 400 billion is needed annually. So a huge disparity there. And even what has been committed has not actually been delivered to the fund. And so they don't even have that much money to program with. So significant challenges again in this area. As mentioned, really hoping to see Canada step up. Canada gave an initial 16 million to this a couple of years ago to the Loss and Damage Fund, just 16 million. It's one of the lowest contributors, but hasn't given anything since or has said they would do anything on this since. So it's an area we certainly need to advocate, and we'll share a link with you right away as well in the chat in one space where you can advocate on that issue specifically. I will pass it off now and let others speak to the issue. Thanks.
Well, so I think we're transitioning to Willard now.
All right, good evening. Thank you. As mentioned, my name is Willard Metzger, the Executive Director of Citizens for Public Justice. And it's a real honor to be here with you today to discuss the key outcomes of COP29, which, as you heard, took place in Baku, Azerbaijan last November. As part of the accredited Canadian delegation, and as Mario mentioned, the only representative in that delegation from a faith-based organization, I was able to have a front row seat to the historic developments on the mitigation efforts and carbon market rules under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So I'm excited to share my experiences as well as my reflections on what these breakthroughs mean for climate justice, both here in Canada and around the world. COP29 was, at least in some ways, a milestone in global climate governance. After years of painstaking negotiations, countries finally reached consensus on the remaining technical pieces of mitigation, or more specifically, Article 6. By mitigation, we mean the actions taken to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases, essentially any efforts that help slow down climate change by cutting emissions at their source or enhancing carbon sinks like forests. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement deals with carbon markets and cooperative approaches that allow countries to meet climate targets together rather than in isolation. So the big news from Baku was that we now have clarity on how these international carbon markets will work going forward. Article 6.2, this part allows for bilateral or plurilateral cooperation between countries, essentially letting one country trade its emission reductions or removals with another. At COP29, parties agreed on a single consolidated platform to track and authorize these trades, introducing a new transparency framework that requires annual disclosures. So this means no more behind the scenes deals. Everything has to be documented and publicly available. Article 6.4, this part sets up what's now called the Paris Agreement Crediting Mechanism. And that is a United Nations supervised system for generating and trading carbon credits. At COP29, countries agreed on how to ensure these credits are of the highest integrity, focusing on genuine additional emission reductions and establishing stricter requirements for projects that involve carbon removals. So this is a major step that could, if done right, funnel critical climate finance into countries that need it most. From a faith-based and justice-oriented perspective, these new rules around Article 6 could be transformative if they're implemented with integrity and equity in mind. First, the operationalization of Article 6 holds the potential to unlock significant additional investment in climate mitigation. Some estimates suggest that if these new carbon markets function effectively, they could generate up to $250 billion in savings globally, freeing up resources to strengthen climate action. We could also see more ambitious NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, because countries will be able to collaborate, pool resources, and trade verified emissions reductions. The new Paris Agreement crediting mechanism can help channel financial resources into projects in developing countries. Ideally, this means more funding for renewable energy, conservation, and sustainable agriculture. It also creates pathways for local communities to participate in and benefit from the green economy. However, it's vital that the oversight bodies keep a very close eye on ensuring that these funds actually reach the vulnerable communities they're meant to serve. We also saw a strong push to triple climate finance to developing nations, a point that was hammered home by many government leaders and civil society advocates, including Citizens for Public Justice and the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. So this is essential for global equity. Countries most impacted by climate change, who have contributed the least to the problem, need and deserve financial and technical support. The Article 6 mechanisms can complement that commitment, but they're not a replacement for direct climate financing. Despite some of these promising outcomes from Baku, there are significant concerns, to say the least, and I'd like to mention 4 of them. The first one, under Article 6.2, the UN won't directly oversee the environmental quality of the credits traded. It'll rely on the reporting and transparency measures that countries put in place. Civil society, therefore, has a big role in holding governments accountable, often through naming and shaming if countries don't meet quality standards. The second concern, many critics argue that climate justice and social safeguards risk becoming afterthoughts in these market mechanisms. The voices of Indigenous peoples and local communities who are disproportionately impacted by climate change must be central to the design and operation of carbon projects. It's crucial that the supervisory body for Article 6.4 ensures robust community engagement, protecting human rights and honoring local stewardship practices. The third concern, there's some uncertainty about how nature-based solutions like forest conservation will be credited under 6.4's stricter standards. We need to ensure that the people who live on and protect these lands, such as Indigenous peoples, aren't marginalized by complex technical rules or by an influx of outside investment. And the fourth concern, reaching an agreement on paper is one thing, but putting it into practice is another. National governments need to quickly adopt these rules and get the infrastructure in place to track and verify projects. So far, only a handful of bilateral trade
We may have lost Willard there for a second. Because maybe we'll move on to Kekishen for now, and we'll let Willard have a final word, unless he's back again later on. Oh yeah, Kekishen, why don't you step in?
Sure. Yeah, thank you everyone, and thank you Mario for the invitation. Hello everyone. Really delighted to be here with all of you today. My name is Kehkasha. I am connecting with you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So really wonderful to connect with all of you on to speak on a topic that is of critical importance and something that is really close to my heart, as well as someone who has been working at the grassroots for over a decade now. And that is the intersection of climate with gender. Now, I think that a lot of people will say that it's like everyone knows that the impacts of climate change are very gendered, but I don't think it's kind of set in as yet that women and girls do face the amplified impacts of climate change because the pre-existing inequalities and inequities are amplified many fold, no matter where we are, whether it's in rural or urban communities. And something the previous speaker stated about, we need to turn commitments into action, that really stood out to me because as a grassroots actor, that is exactly where my organization and I come in, where we're the ones turning the talk that goes on at all these international conferences into ground level action. So I'm the founder president of Green Hope Foundation, which is a Canadian not-for-profit. We're headquartered here in Toronto, but we work in 28 countries with over 500,000 people addressing all of these intersectional impacts of climate change on, every single aspect of sustainability, but really adopting a feminist approach to do so. And we recognize that we are in an age of social and ecological violence as a result of climate change. But it's important for us to recognize that because climate change is this intersectional issue that affects every single aspect of sustainability, but it also impacts our most vulnerable first. And that is why it's so important for us to address this intersection of gender equality and climate change and how we need feminist climate justice at all spaces, whether it's in the policymaking level or at the ground level, to achieve a more sustainable present and future. So I wanted to share with you first how we go about turning these commitments into ground level action and how we've been doing that for the past, it's going to be 13 years this year. I founded Green Hope Foundation at the age of 12. So we'll be turning 13 years old this year. So we're really excited about that. What we do is we work to address environmental conservation, social equity, and economic stability. And then we see how all of that intersects with both climate and gender. And a lot of our work harnesses clean tech for social good. So ensuring that innovation also plays a really important role in driving forward these ground level solutions. So one intersection that we see is that's really important is climate, gender, and education. So how does that play out at the grassroots level? So for instance, in rural Bangladesh, we have our solar-powered Academy of Hope for women and girls. So this is an educational institution that provides climate education to girls in the mornings, and then it functions as a sewing school for women in the evenings, enabling them to have a stable source of income to support themselves and their families. We've built solar-powered computer labs that provide STEM and STEAM education in climate disaster zones in Liberia and in India, and in the Sundarbans, which is on the border of Bangladesh and India, world's largest mangrove forest, to ensure that the children there who are not going to school as a result of climate change and the climate change and disasters don't fall behind and become a lost generation. And this enables them to get good jobs. We also distribute routers to communities within climate disaster zones so that the young people are actually able to connect to the internet and have cellular service. During the pandemic, we realized that COVID and climate change did not create a very conducive learning environment, specifically for girls who were forced to drop out of school at an unprecedented rate. So our solar-powered mobile libraries now take books to the doorstep of thousands of out-of-school children, especially girls, across countries in Asia and Africa. Now, from education, we move to health. So how do we address the intersection of climate, gender, and good health and well-being? So in a lot of the communities that we work in that are extremely climate vulnerable, we see that women are often tasked with cooking, and the methods that they use for cooking ensure that they inhale smoke every single time they cook. And so obviously that leads to severe respiratory issues, while at the same time contributing to emissions of greenhouse gases. So we distribute and train women in using solar, electric, and eco cookers. This is in Bangladesh and Liberia and in India to protect their health within the climate disaster zones, and of course, help in reduction of emissions. We've distributed solar lamps to women across and youth across Nepal, the Sundarbans, and India to ensure they have a source of light at night to study. And in a lot of climate disaster zones, we see that the psychological safety of women and girls is just at the bottom of the priority list when it comes to rebuilding. So women and girls feel extremely unsafe coming out of their homes in the evenings. I mean, that's a story everywhere. But here within the climate disaster zones, they're much, much more likely to be raped, trafficked, abused. And so to provide them with that psychological safety and ensure that they have this the option of mobility, we built solar-powered streetlights and also to ensure that girls feel safe going to school at dawn. So this is in Bangladesh, this is in Liberia, and our most recent one was in Cambodia. Now, taking care of our health, that also includes, addressing things like water security. And how does that intersect with climate and gender? We've built deep bore tube wells in climate disaster zones to ensure that climate vulnerable communities have access to clean drinking water. We work a lot on climate adaptation. So in communities where it's really monsoon heavy, so making use of the heavier monsoon seasons due to climate change and utilizing that for rainwater harvesting. And in Kenya, we work on providing communities with reusable water storage containers so that they at least have a way of storing the water and the girls aren't forced to continue to walk every single day to fetch water, a walk that we all know gets more arduous due to climate change. We've also built solar-powered water farms, so in Cambodia and in Kiribati. Now, these act as distillation systems to purify water and do so addressing the impacts of climate change in different ways. So in Cambodia, it is to purify the river water that is extremely polluted so that the communities have access to clean drinking water. In Kiribati, since it's a small island developing state, it's to purify the salty brackish water that's coming in and polluting the groundwater as a result of rising sea levels. So two different impacts of climate change, but the solution is then localized to help address the needs and wants of the communities. And of course, the women and girls benefit tremendously from this because water again becomes their domain in a lot of these communities. And when we speak of water, we can't forget hygiene and sanitation. So we've built sanitation stations in several communities that we were working in, both during the climate change-induced disasters as well as during the pandemic, because we saw that was a necessity, especially for women and girls. We build toilets in climate disaster zones because, again, women's health and women's needs are something that's just not considered when climate change and disasters hit because of pre-existing inequalities. And we work as well on climate, gender, and food security. So we have our Grow Your Own Food campaign that's actually led by our girls from across the world. So from Canada to Oman to UAE to India to Bangladesh. And we work in this way to make sure that we're addressing the specific food insecurity impacts caused by climate change. So here in Kiribati, we grow food in pots because of what I mentioned earlier about the soil being too salty. So they can't grow the crops there. So pots it is. And again, the food, taking care of the food falls to the domain of women. So we are working with the Indigenous women and girls to help them reclaim that food security. Similarly, on the outskirts of Lima in Peru, we are working with Indigenous women and girls to reclaim previously used land that had previously been used for cash crops. So not only revitalizing the land, but also providing food security to the Indigenous communities there. And here in Canada, we have our own farm. So it's solar powered, it's organic farming. We have huge vegetables that grow there. And what we do is we use this farm as a way to educate the children that we work with and the students that we work with by partnering with various school boards to provide them with this really important climate education through growing their own food. And we also work on teaching children how to compost. So this is our member, the UAE, who has a compost bin on his balcony. We also work on using solar for agriculture, so using agrivoltaics in several rural communities to empower rural women and young farmers to grow their own food underneath solar panels. And most recently, if you see our social media pages for the last few years, we've been working on empowering tiger widows. So women who've lost their husbands to tiger attacks in the Sundarbans, which is the world's largest mangrove forest, as I mentioned earlier, and they're seen as pariahs in society because of their widowhood and how they lost their husbands. So this is our way of making sure that in a severely climate vulnerable community, they have the means to take control of their life again, to have a stable source of income, to send their children to school, and just to be able to live life. So this is through fish farming by repopulating their ponds. Most recently, just like a few days ago, this is through poultry farming and duck distribution. So again, working to empower them within in the face of climate change. And finally, we work on climate and biodiversity conservation. So we've planted over 1.2 million trees globally. Our young members have done it all across the world, from Canada to Barbados to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And we've planted over 100,000 mangroves worldwide, everywhere from the Bahamas to Suriname to Vietnam. And again, it's all undertaken by our young members. And what we do as we continue our grassroots work, we are accredited to the UN. So we connect the work that we do with what is talked about at the United Nations and really try to bridge the gap between the top-down and bottom-up processes. And so we've been doing this again since our inception. So my very first COP was in 2012, at the time when under 18s were still not allowed in. So the day I was invited to speak was the only day that I was allowed in. Now, of course, that rule has changed. Like, we fought really hard to get that changed, but it was still very, very exclusionary. And we wanted to make sure that the voices of the grassroots, those at the grassroots, was getting heard. And so from 2012 in Doha to Peru in 2014 to Bonn in 2017 to to Glasgow in 2021, Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022, Dubai 2023, and most recently in Baku in 2024, we have been advocating for bridging this top-down, bottom-up gap and making sure that we're not just moving forward with commitments and not just conference hopping. We're actually looking at these these conferences as a way for us to come together to discuss ideas and solutions and ensure that we actually implement what is being talked about after these and during and after these conferences are over. And so as at Green Hope Foundation, that is really our mandate, to make sure that we bring this feminist lens to achieving climate justice, to achieving sustainable development, and so that we are actually able to address this gendered burden of climate change and make sure that we can create a world where no one is left behind and everyone has a life of dignity. So true justice. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kikashan. And now, Naomi.
Sure. So just to come back to kind of where are we now then? So you've heard a little bit about the negotiations and where global policy is at. You know, there's a need for funding that's not quite being met. In Canada, we're in a very, very uncertain times, aren't we? We're not sure who the leader of the Liberal Party will be. We do not know when elections will be. And it's a very tricky time to advocate and influence policy. We also have a neighbor to the south of us who is very hard to predict what those policies will be as well. And so all of this kind of impacts what's going to happen with climate change and how countries will support each other or not. Again, climate change is part of aid. So when we see these significant cuts to aid budgets or talks about cutting aid budgets, that's going to be climate as well. That's climate, that's everything that's supporting people around the world. And we know it's such a critical thing to do, both to in its own right, but also if we want to live in a more secure and peaceful world for all of us. These are things we need to address together. Just to let you know more specifically, the policy on Canada's next climate finance package was supposed to come to cabinet this recently in January. That never happened. There was a lot of discussion and focus on tariffs, as you can imagine. So it's now expected to come to cabinet in the fall. So really don't know which government that will be. Either way, it will be under very fiscally constrained times and frameworks. So we may see cuts in those areas. More than ever right now, advocacy is needed to engage with MPs, people in government now, people who may be in government going forward, to let them know that we think this is really important aid and we want to keep working on these issues. Aid and climate change, these are things we need to address, and it's really important we speak out now. Also, just to flag that COP30, the next COP is coming down the road next winter in Brazil, and that one's expected to be quite a big one because it's the 15th anniversary, or sorry, the 10th anniversary from the Paris Agreement, and also countries are supposed to come with new nationally determined contributions, NDCs. What that means is this is they're going to say how they're addressing climate change, what they're doing in their country, what they're doing to help others. This is where it's all coming together, and we really are supposed to see whether or not these sort of multilateral systems and processes that bring the world together can stay strong and take some critical action. So just to say lots is needed. On that note, I'd like to pass it off to, I believe, Megan right now, who I think will touch on the advocacy component more specifically a little more. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening and hanging in with us.
Thanks, Naomi. That was fast. I see that Willard has joined us back now. Are you there, Willard?
Yes, thank you. It seems that Rogers has gone down in Ottawa area, at least this neighborhood part. So sorry about
no.
that. I'm just connecting by phone now.
That's okay. We wanted to give space. Kikshan spoke while you were away, but if you'd like to finish, that would be great.
Well, all right. I cut out just saying that Citizens for Public Justice, that we believe this is a moral imperative. Is that right? That's what you last heard?
You were just going into the 4 reasons, and I don't remember at which point you
Oh,
disappeared.
okay. So you didn't hear the four concerns?
I think we may have heard the first 3. I remember
Okay.
at least.
Okay.
Okay,
Yes.
all right. So maybe I'll just pick up on the fourth concern then is, as you know, of course, reaching an agreement on paper is one thing, but putting it into practice is another. So national governments need to quickly adopt these rules and get the infrastructure in place to track and to verify the projects. So far, only a handful of bilateral trades have actually gone through, even though many other countries have signaled their interest. And as Citizens for Public Justice, we deeply believe in the moral imperative of climate change. So the new Article 6 framework must not become a loophole for wealthier nations or corporations to buy cheap credits without making real changes at home. Instead, we hope that these mechanisms become powerful tools for global equity, driving down emissions while supporting communities on the front line of the climate crisis. For us, carbon markets must be more than a financial instrument. They should be part of a broader moral and ethical shift towards stewardship, restoration, and reconciliation with the earth and with each other. As we look ahead, the big question is how well countries, businesses, and organizations implement these rules with integrity. Will this new Article 6 architecture truly raise ambition and direct resources to those who need them most? Will it protect and empower Indigenous communities and local stewards of the land? These are the questions we need to be asking and answering. So if you take away one thing, let it be this. We need to celebrate the progress of COP29, but we also must remain vigilant to ensure this progress translates into tangible, equitable climate action. So I urge each and every one of you to stay engaged through our organization's initiatives and campaigns in order to advance the cause of creation care and to champion the voices of marginalized communities and climate survivors here on Parliament Hill. So thank you for listening. Thank you for letting me pick up the final few comments, and I'll look forward to questions at the end.
Thanks, Willie. That was worth waiting.
And I see Megan may be having her own technical issues now. It's not a good technology day for us, is it? So I might just use that time while Megan logs back in and speak a little bit about something that I was going to mention. And earlier, I mentioned that I would highlight one of our advocacy campaigns at Citizens for Public Justice, and that's our Linton environmental campaign, which is called Give It Up for the Earth. This campaign was actually released today, only a few hours ago, and I was very keen on doing that in order to allow all of you to take part in it. You would be the first to send these open letters to the ministers and the leaders of political parties, but I will get into it. So this campaign centers on 3 action items that we encourage folks to take during Lent, the season of Lent, which this year is starting on March 5th, 2025, and it's extending until April 17th, 2025. So what do we want you to do during Lent? 1, pledge to reduce your own personal or household greenhouse gas emissions. 2, commit to embracing eco-spirituality through climate action. and by building relationships with indigenous communities on whose traditional territories we live, work, and play. And you're already doing at least half of that because you're here learning about eco-spirituality and climate action. And three, which is a sort of central piece of the campaign, to send an open letter to the leaders of all national political parties in the lead up to the federal elections, as well as the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, Natural Resource Canada, and the Minister of Finance. And we're urging them to adopt more ambitious climate action targets and to support a just transition for a low carbon economy, to a low carbon economy. Now you may be wondering, what does this open letter call for? And the open letter has also three primary advocacy asks, because we like to talk in threes. The first one is to eliminate all forms of fossil fuel subsidies in 2023 alone, fossil fuel subsidies were $28.5 billion. The second one is that we need to triple Canada's climate finance contributions to 15.9 billion annually. And again, Naomi spoke in length about that. And the third one is to endorse the Jubilee 2025 petition's calls to cancel unjust debt and facilitate global financial reforms that mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis on global South countries. Although Lent doesn't start or doesn't begin until March 5th, we specifically launched the campaign earlier today in order to capture the voices of justice-minded and equity-seeking communities like yourselves through signing the open letter. So these signatures can help set the political tone for the upcoming federal election, and they also hugely influence party leadership conversations. It is vital that decision makers hear from Canadians about the importance of climate action and justice, especially now in the current political environment that we're in. My colleague will share the link to the Give It Up for the Earth open letter campaign and the open letter in the chat. Please sign as you're able, and thanks in advance for making your voice heard. And the second campaign that we are leading simultaneously, and which I just mentioned in passing, is the Jubilee 2025 Turn Debt into Hope campaign. Historically, the liturgical tradition of Jubilee calls for the release of debts, liberation of slaves, and the returning of land to original owners, a powerful biblical symbol of restoration and renewal. But now in collaboration with 4 other faith-based organizations like Kairos Canada and Development and Peace, CPJ is leading an ecumenical Jubilee campaign in Canada this year. You may be asking, why would I join this year's Jubilee campaign, especially a campaign that calls for debt forgiveness at a time in which we all know that we're experiencing our own financial challenges here in Canada. More than 3.3 billion people live in countries where debt repayments exceed spending on health and education combined, standing in the way of sustainable development, climate action, and basic human dignity. Meanwhile, nations like Canada and multinational corporations exploit resources from these countries and Indigenous communities here in Canada, perpetuating human rights violations and ecological destruction. In other words, the global North owes the global South indigenous peoples an ecological debt. And one of the best ways for this debt to be repaid is the cancellation of unjust bilateral debt. My colleague will also drop the link to CPJ's Jubilee campaign in the chat, and I invite you to sign the petition and circulate it among your friends and family. I will throw it back quickly to Megan again for her to finish her thoughts. Sorry for the interruption, Megan.
Oh, that's okay. The storm is really starting to pick out here. I wonder if that was giving Willard a hard time. So we're over time, so I'll just make a couple of comments and then we'll send us off for the evening. Is that what we're doing? Okay. So I'll mention 3 things quickly, and in a shorter version than I had planned, just so that you're aware, but for things that we can do to take action related to intersection of climate and food security from our perspective. We've talked a little bit about the kind of conversation in the media around foreign aid and the shifting political landscape in Canada around some of these issues. So we'd like to invite you to add your voice if you're interested to help us protect Canada's strong track record in working towards ending global hunger. And by participating in a call campaign, if this is of interest to you and you feel like you're someone who could leave a phone call to express your support as part of this call campaign by leaving a voicemail after hours at your MP's office, and we'd provide you with a short prepared script, please email us. And the email is going into the chat as we speak. But we're going to see more of these kind of incidences and conversations and this subject. We're seeing that south of the border, and it's going to become more frequent here in Canada. So if that aligns with how you like to take action, please send me an email message. Again, looking forward to the spring or maybe the fall. The Foodgrains Bank has produced an election tool. It's a PDF, it's printable. It's to help you, your friends, family at home engage with candidates who may be canvassing or phone calling you in the lead up to elections. So it provides some guidance on how to talk to people about Canadian aid, about climate resilient food systems, and generally their party's platform with regard to addressing hunger. And the link is now in the chat and you can download that. The last thing to mention, another link will go into the chat, is in support of the work that Naomi's referenced with the Canadian Foodgrains Bank and the kind of current government's commitments to increasing aid, reaching up to 2030 in the new coming package. We're grateful for that commitment, as Naomi said, but we're urging more ambition to achieve some important development goals. Hunger is one of them. So we have an online letter builder at our website, and you can have a look at that link. And it just takes you a couple of minutes to complete that letter. You can personalize it at any step along the way, but it's a way to speak very quickly, like I'm not exaggerating, a few minutes to send a letter to the Minister of Finance, copying the Minister of International Development and your own Member of Parliament to speak in support of resilient food systems and climate finance, and all of the threads that we've been talking about tonight are represented in that letter. I think if I'm not forgetting anything, I feel really bad that we didn't get a chance to do a Q&A this evening, but if you, I don't know if Mario, you said this while I was missing, but if you had a question and we didn't get a chance to address it tonight because we've had a couple of issues, please put your question into the chat. We'll keep the chat record and make sure that your question finds the speaker that's related to it and get you a response by email in the next little while. Feels not great to be able to engage with you in that way, but want to wrap up this evening in a good way, because we're thankful that you've joined us here tonight. And the last couple of things that'll go into the chat are the ways to sign up to continue in contact and get updates and news and invitation to events from CPJ and from the Canadian Foodgrains Bank. We're a mixed audience here tonight, and it's nice to kind of mix and mingle as co-collaborators in the movement work that we're doing. That's my phone telling me that the webinar should be over now. We're almost there. So please, as you see that link, please sign up and stay connected because we're all doing different work, swimming in the same river. So if some of you saw, I wore my Valentine's Day sweater tonight because I'm feeling really just a lot of desire and joy in friendship and in solidarity to send you out from here, knowing that tomorrow is Valentine's Day. To just send you with a blessing and all the advocating and the peace building and justice seeking work that we do together as a sector, as Canadians, as people, as colleagues across the planet. So just, yeah, go in friendship, love, solidarity. Keep doing what you're doing. Thanks for being here tonight, everybody. Good night.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.